They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The town of Marrow Bend lay like a wrinkle in the prairie, a strip of weathered wood and corrugated iron where wind ate at porches and kept secrets in the eaves. It was the sort of place where the sun set with a hard edge, throwing long, thin shadows across floorboards and faces. Dust settled into the seams of clothes, into the old man's cuffs and the little girl's braids. The saloon sat at the center of the town like a stubborn tooth, equal parts refuge and wound, its doors creaking whenever someone crossed its threshold, its windows leaking lamplight into the street at night. She worked there, behind the counter and the stove and the sink, moving in a rhythm that had been learned from hunger and duty. Her name was Lila May, though most people shortened it in their heads to the help and said less to her face. Lila kept to herself. She spoke when it was necessary and otherwise let her work be a language. Hands washing, pots steaming, a cloth folded exactly so. Her hair was a coil that escaped at the nape of her neck. Her hands were mud-caked and calloused, the knuckles white when she gripped a pan. She wore practical things. A plain dress patched at the hem, boots that had been reliable when nothing else was, and an apron heavy with the smell of coffee and flour. She smelled of starch and stove smoke and something softer that clung like a second skin. Kindness. Marrow Bend liked to remind the world who ran things. There was Mayor Benning, who favored starched collars and small, sharp sentences. There was Mrs. Cartwright, who had a way of smiling like a reward and scolding like a verdict. There was Pastor Hale, whose sermons were lace and thunder. Each of them had power cultivated over years. A dry look, a well-placed compliment, the right name dropped into the right ear. They called Lila meek. They said she had no backbone. They measured people by what they owned and how loudly they could pronounce their own worth. On a morning when the sky held its breath and spring was only just thinking about climbing out of winter's pocket, Lila set a kettle on the stove and lit the coal underneath. The sound was small at first, a murmuring under the lid. Then the whistle rose, high and sharp like a question. The saloon began to fill with the usual patrons. A card player with stooped shoulders, a father who smelled of sweat and hay, an old gambler who held the sun's lines on his face like a map. Boots tapped on floorboards. The doors creaked. A whistle came in time with coffee pouring into tin mugs, steam curling like a promise. Lila moved with a steadiness that had been her anchor for years. She ladled stew with a hand that did not tremble. She set mugs down where hands could find them. She kept her eyes on the work and let the world slide past, because there was safety in small tasks, in the momentum of a clean pan and the rhythm of a broom over a worn mat. She had learned to be unnoticed the way some learn to be brave, out of necessity and habit both. People dismissed what they didn't fear. They mocked what they could not change. "You there, Lila?" said Mrs. Cartwright one morning, as if the room belonged to her and not to the sun that fell through the window. Her voice was syrup and gravel both. She had pearls she wore like accusations. "Do you ever think of dressing like a lady? The men here giving you the look like you're from a different county. It's unbecoming." Lila paused, wiping the rim of a mug with a cloth. Her hand didn't shake, but the cloth folded under her fingers, an old habit of busying the hands when the heart had to steady itself. She answered in the small, even voice she gave to necessary things. "I wear what I can afford, ma'am. The apron keeps the worst of the dirt off." Mrs. Cartwright's smile was the sort that cut a name from someone's life. "And what of the mark on your arm?" she asked louder now, drawing eyes. "It might be nothing, or it might be... Well, you can't tell me surely you haven't been mixed up in some trouble." Heads turned. The room narrowed like a lens. Lila felt a slow pressure, like wind building behind a door. She could have answered. She could have said how the mark had come when she'd stood stubborn against a man who'd thought his coin meant he could lay hands where he pleased. She could have said how those hands had had no apologies to offer and how the scar was a map she carried daily. She could have said that she had been a widow for 5 years and the silence of her house was another kind of shiver. But she didn't. She let the cloth drag across the mug and left the rest of the sentence to the room. "Lila's always been steady," a voice said from the far table. It was low and rough as gravel, and when she looked up, the room seemed to tilt like a plate set down wrong. He sat with a back that might have been carved of oak and a hat tipped like a secret. Men like him didn't come to Marrow Bend often, and when they did, people noticed. His clothes were plain but clean in a way that suggested care rather than coin. His boots were worn to a shape that fit him like a second skin. His fingers were thick, with a rim of dirt that suggested work or something worse. A shadow lived under one eye, as though the sun had kept a secret from him. There was a scar that started at his temple and fell across the cheek and which his shadowed hat never hid. When he spoke, his voice was small in a room where small voices were easily swallowed. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The words were quiet, but because of the low place they came from, they cut clean through the chatter like a knife edge. People turned, not because they were rude but because a pronouncement like that was currency here, and people needed to know who to spend on. The sheriff shifted in his chair. The mayor cleared his throat. Mrs. Cartwright's mouth tightened like she had swallowed wrong. "What do you mean, mister?" she started. Then the card player's laughter tried to fill the space and failed. He set his mug on the counter with the care of someone who had carried more than one bad luck and kept counting it. He had come to town as one of those things the horizon coughs up. A stranger with too many winters behind him and something buried in his eyes. His name was Jonah Crow, though some of the men who noticed such things had other names for him in whispers: outlaw, gunrunner, wardrifted. He let people choose gossip like they did cards. He did not offer reasons. "I mean that she stands when folks smile and when they don't," Jonah said. "I mean she moves like she belongs even when the town says she don't. That takes a kind of courage." The room shuffled, a small earthquake of unease. Lila felt her face warm and her hands dropped the rag, but she caught it before it hit the floor. She did not speak. He continued, voice low and without the show of someone trying to be kind because he had no kindness to show. "Be nice to the steady ones," Jonah said. "You don't know when you'll need one to steady you." The words landed in Lila like rain on coals, an odd mixture of heat and relief. Someone had named the thing she had always turned into a rhythm of living. She had been steady quietly, as one might hold a pan from the fire or a baby from a fall. She had learned not to look for reward. She had learned to fold her pride like a shirt and put it away so it wouldn't wrinkle further. Days went on. Jonah lingered. He would sit at a corner table and watch as Lila moved, and sometimes he would ask for coffee, and sometimes he would simply pay for nothing and tip a useful amount. He had a way of listening that was less about hearing and more about showing the world that there was a witness. It made people uncomfortable, as the presence of truth tends to do. It made Lila uneasy only because attention had a way of moving like a shadow. Sometimes when it fell wrong it made her feel like something had noticed the open place in her and chosen to point. There were whispers in the street. People speculated about Jonah and his past because rumor requires a body to stand on when it feeds. Some said he'd been a soldier, hardened by what he'd seen. Others said he'd been with men whose business did not involve asking permission. When people labeled him, they did it loudly and in neat rows, as if names could explain everything. Jonah paid none of it mind. He came, he pulled a chair close to the stove, and he watched Lila without being a study in any of the legends. One afternoon, as a storm was thinking about coming and the light leaned into the room like a tired horse, Lila noticed the child in the corner of the saloon. The girl had dirt on her knees and a hand wrapped around a ripped doll. She watched the card players like a bird watching for crumbs. People did not see her much. She belonged to the back streets and to a mother who drank to forget the edges of a life. The child's name was Annabelle, and she had come into the saloon asking for a cup of buttermilk and a coin to send home. The card players barked jokes that were not meant for children and the men tossed pennies like bones. Lila moved without asking permission. She poured a cup and put a biscuit on a plate and slid them across to the girl like a judge passing mercy. "Eat, love," Lila murmured. It was small and without fanfare. The child's hands were too small and too quick. She ate as if the taste had been a prayer held in the mouth. Mrs. Cartwright watched. "Feeding freeloaders will be the death of us," she sighed, sharp as a plaster. "You seen this, Lila?" Always giving away what don't belong to you, the words had a barbed quality, meant to remind Lila of the rules of Marrow Bend, which was to say, the rules of those who thought they owned more than they did. Lila looked at the child's mouth, the crumbs on the chin, the small hands that clutched the doll depending on what it could give her. She thought of the mark on her own arm, the quiet oath she had made in a winter some years back, the memory of being lifted like an offering and left. She thought of small hands that needed steadiness. "Leave the girl be," Jonah said simply. His voice was a line drawn between what was true and what was polite. The room inhaled as if trying to catch a rumor before it flew. The sheriff's forked glance tried to weigh both sides. Mrs. Cartwright's lips pressed so thin a seam of disapproval stayed. "You shouldn't go soft, Lila," she said. "You'll be taken advantage of." Lila's jaw tightened. The apron at her waist burned with the heat of the stove and held the scent of flour like a shield. She said nothing. She had learned that politeness was often poverty in a dress, and that kindly words could be a weapon when wielded by those with no need for them. Later, after the card players had left and the wind had set the sign creaking, Jonah stayed and washed his own mug. He worked with a focus that was like prayer, rubbery hands moving in a way that suggested repetition and a life of doing things without asking for notice. Lila watched him from the doorway where the lamplight fell across her like a benediction. There was something about the steadiness of his motions that matched hers. "You didn't have to speak for me," she said quietly. Her voice was the color of threadbare cloth. He looked up, and for a moment the room tightened like a fist. His eyes were gray, the way a late winter sky might be gray, not yet full of the blue that argues with winter's hold. "Maybe I thought it might keep you from being stepped on," he said. He rinsed the last of the tea from the cup, and his shoulders seemed to drop like a house settling after a storm. Lila kept her distance. There was something dangerous in the way Jonah's presence softened the edges of the world around her, and she had learned to hate feeling soft. Softness had a way of inviting mess. But Jonah's hands were clean when he set the mug on the rack, and for a moment Lila thought of what it would mean to let someone see her in full without yanking away. Days braided into one another. Jonah's watchfulness grew into small kindnesses. A sash pinned where the thread had snapped, a folded coin left on a counter with a note, "For bread." No questions. Once, when the bar stove had coughed and refused to catch, Jonah put his shoulder to a part of the old iron and got soot on his cuffs. The men in town noticed and called it an excuse. Jonah paid them their attention by not looking at it. To him, things were what they were. A stove to be warmed, a woman who needed more than a careful nod. He spoke about nothing, and that was something. He talked of the road as if it had been a living thing worthy of some respect. He held his stories close and told them in the small pieces that mattered. An account of a fire that took a man's hand, the memory of a horse that had been steady when men were not. He did not boast. He disclosed, but only what he saw fit to leave behind. Lila listened like someone who collected stars, careful and precise. She had a kindness for facts. She had a hunger for small truths under the weight of rumor. Then there was the day of the fair. The town gathered on the outskirts where hay wagons rested and the sun struck the prairie like a bell. People came to show off chickens, to make deals, to eat sweet cakes made by hands that chewed at their own pride. Marrow Bend's yearly fair was a place where status showed its colors. Men arranged their best hats on heads like banners. Women smoothed their skirts as if ironing out sins. Lila dusted flour from her apron and tied ribbons on pies she would sell at a table, selling them quietly because the work in her bones knew the difference between show and necessary bread. Mrs. Cartwright, resplendent in a dress that seemed to have been cut by rules and praise, decided it was the perfect day to heap humiliation on Lila. People lined up to look at chickens and to trade knives. Mrs. Cartwright found her, and with the sanctimony of a woman who had been taught to measure others by a thin seam of propriety, she said to the town, loud enough for the judge and the preacher and a few overhearing neighbors, "Lila May won't be showing any of her pies tomorrow in the cook-off, I trust. Wouldn't want her to embarrass herself trying to be one of us." It was a dull blade and yet meant to carry a whole sentence. The room waited to see how a person who had been reduced might respond. Lila felt the world tighten around her like clothes on a thin body. Her hands found the edge of the table. The wood was smooth under her fingers, familiar and honest in its own stationary way. Her mouth wanted to answer, to say that her pies were made with honest eggs gathered from hens in a coop not owned by the town's fine ladies, that her flour had been sacked under hands that had known labor, but she kept her voice small and allowed the silence to become armor. Jonah stepped forward before Lila could, his chair scraping in a way that sounded loud for its purpose. He looked at Mrs. Cartwright and then around the town like someone counting the steps of a song he had once known. The quiet in him was not the same as Lila's. His quiet had been bargained for in places where shouting cost lives. When he spoke, the sound did not pander. "I'm puttin' down money on Lila's pie," Jonah said. The words landed like a stone in the small lake and made ripples over the faces surrounding them. "Money enough to make a new wagon axle. If she loses, I'll pay for the judge's last drink. If she wins, I'll buy the first round for this town." Mrs. Cartwright's mouth fell open like a trap sprung. "And who are you two?" she started. Jonah looked at her with a patience that was part judgment and part an old forgiveness. "A man who knows what good looks like," he said. "Sometimes it's plain, and sometimes it's bitter. But it's still good." People muttered. Mayor Benning cleared his throat and said something about propriety and about standards. But the wind had already turned. When Lila stepped forward to place her pies on the judging table, she felt Jonah's eyes on her like a steadying hand. She felt something open inside her that was like a window on a locked room. There was new air and it smelled like possible things. The judges tasted. They wrote notes. They pretended to be arbiters of a contest that, in the end, was about more than pastries. When the announcement came, Jonah's small smile hadn't changed. Lila stood still as a mule. The judge's voice read, and when it hit Lila's name in the line of winners, the saloon exploded with movement like a flock flown up too fast. "First prize goes to Lila May," said the judge. There was a silence that followed which felt like the town exhaling for the first time in many days. People came to her table to pat a shoulder, or to offer a hand in ways that tried to be both belated and useful. Mrs. Cartwright's smile had narrowed to a thing like a threat. Some of the townsfolk spoke quieter now, like people beginning to learn a new syllable in an old language. For the first time in a long time, Lila allowed something like a smile. It wasn't showy. It was small and honest and fit the tilt of her face. The turn of events did not make everyone love her. Small towns are long in the habit of remembering who they think they are and who they say others must be. When a rumor sprang up that Lila had been sold into something before she had married, and that Jonah had come in order to take advantage of the pity of an upright population, the town's small cruel creatures had a field day. Gossip multiplied like mice under a barn. In the days that followed, the cruelty took on manners. People who had praised her pies earlier had advice now on what to buy and how to mend the way she walked. Children were taught to stare. Men who had bowed to her steady kindness now looked at Jonah as if a stain of wanting had been laid over them both. Lila turned inward. She pulled her apron on like armor and tried to be invisible again. Then came the night when cruelty no longer needed the gentleness of nuance. It was a night of rain that sounded like a million fingers tapping with impatience against the windows. The saloon was warm inside, steam hanging like lazy ghosts above tin cups. A group of men swaggered in, the sort that wear trouble like a coat and thought themselves wrapped safe. Words were made of sharper things. Voices grew. Lila kept her hands folded around a pot and tried to make her breathing steady. But sometimes a thing waits for a moment, like a trap waiting for a foot. "Looks to me like Lila's been keeping more than cups warm," one of the men said, loud and needing more laughter than the room could spare. He made a show of clapping Jonah on the back, a motion that had the arrogance of strength on display. Jonah's jaw tightened, and for a second the room could taste the change in him. Lila's face went cold as a wash of old fear. She had been taught early on to take blows by turning them into practical things to fix. She had been taught to hold on till the hurt was smaller. The men circled like beetles on a sweet thing. One of them caught at the hem of her dress as she tried to move away, fingers too familiar with using force as persuasion. Something inside Jonah broke open. People later would try to call it many things. Valor, a sense of justice, temper that finds its fire. It was quieter than any of those. It was that long, buried thing men like him carry from their pasts. A memory of someone who couldn't be left without someone standing. For a moment the room held its breath like a lung. He moved like a man who had rehearsed stepping in his own mind 1,000 times, and yet every entrance felt new. One hand on the offender's wrist, the other on the man's collar. Jonah said nothing loud, but something in him tasted finality. The room stilled. Words found nothing to land on. The men who had thought themselves men were now far less sure. "You take your hand off of her," Jonah said. The voice came not as a shout but as a law. The one who had laid hands on Lila laughed, and it was a sound that wanted trouble. "And who are you to tell me what to do? Some outlaw playing sheriff now?" Jonah's thumb pressed into the man's palm, not enough to hurt but enough to let him know force could be quiet and precise. "I'm the man who don't like seeing a woman in my sight dishonored," he said. "And I'm the man who won't watch it happen without making it stop." The saloon felt like a living thing then, a heart beating fast. The men shuffled back. The sheriff, who had been leaning against the bar trying to remain large, found his eyes on Jonah like someone looking for the end of a rope. He had the right to break this, and what he chose said more about him than any sermon. "You boys best be going," the sheriff said, voice uncertain, as if he had found his boots in a different place than he remembered. The men left with a muttered threat, and their steps slotted through the damp night like promises they didn't intend to keep. Lila, hands trembling now like leaves in late frost, looked at Jonah with an expression that was complicated by many things. Gratitude, yes, and the shock of being held like a thing worth guarding. There was also a shy astonishment, like a window opening to a sky she had not dared to imagine. "You didn't have to," she said. Her voice was small, and there was the taste of something like fear. She had seen men take kindness and turn it to an angle for their own ends. She had been forced to learn that caution in the school of hard days. He held her gaze like a thing he was indebted to keep. "Maybe I did," he said. "I don't aim to be the kind of man who stands by. I only aim to be the kind who stands." She could not hold such a man at arm's length forever. There was the pull of him like a horse that knows its way home, and she felt it but was not sure she trusted the road. Her life had been made of small, steady things. Adding a person who held storms in his hands felt like building a new room on top of a house that had long been leaning. Still, the warmth in his voice was a kind of promise. She let it be because what else could she do? They spoke, later, sitting on the saloon steps as the rain played a wash of silver across the street. Jonah did not ask her to tell his story. He revealed it in small things by accident. A scar, a phrase, the way he watched the horizon. He was a man with a past crowded with absences. He'd carried a pistol and kept it because sometimes the world would demand a measure of answer. He had lost a brother in a fight and a horse in the same winter. He spoke of a time when violence had been an honest tool and when it had been a cruel substitute for mercy. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked only to show that he had learned to hide his worst self. Lila told him things too. She told him about a house that grew too quiet in the night after a man's laughter stopped, about the dishes that stacked like monuments, about the mark that was a map on her arm. Her voice faltered at times, but it did not break. There was a steadiness to it that matched Jonah's, and he listened like someone who prized stories as if they were a kind of currency. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said once, voice small as a kiss and as sure as a saddle strap. "Not if you don't want to." She looked at him then, properly, the way a person might look at a horse they had been thinking about borrowing, with the weighing of merits and the size of need. There was hunger behind her eyes, not always the hunger for bread but the hunger for being seen. She let herself feel that hunger for a breath, and it tasted like thunder. In the months that followed, they found their way toward each other like two roads beginning to smooth at the same point. Jonah added small things to Lila's life. A new pan that did not stick, a repaired handle on the milk churn, a handful of coins on a morning when hard weather had taken more than it gave. He did not give with the showmanship of a man who needed thanks. He gave with the quiet of someone who was trying to rewrite the ledger of his life. Lila, in return, taught him the rhythm of ordinary courage. She had compassion that was not sentimental. She had strength rooted in, day out work and a life that did not allow for grand gestures because it had to be practical about kindness. She taught Jonah the names of things on the prairie and the way to bandage a horse that had been nicked. She also taught him, in small ways, the courage to stand in public with truth. They did not kiss in the initial days. Their intimacy was a slow thing, like bread left to rise under a shawl, proofing time for their two lives. There was longing in their hands, in exchange of bread, in the way Jonah would stand by the stove and watch Lila knead with a concentration that was both prayer and work. There were times when silence stretched between them and it was full of words not yet placed into air, and in those silences there was comfort. Other forces in Marrow Bend did not like the change. There were whispers that Jonah would take from the town more than he gave, that Lila would be dragged into the kind of trouble men like Jonah dragged behind them like a shadow. The town had old fears of being overtaken by new things. Men in positions of power, who had always kept the rules and the gossip, began to test whether Jonah was more than a passing storm. Then came the day when a stranger rode into town, a man on a horse that looked like it had been put together from wind and caution. He brought a letter and a look that meant trouble for Jonah. The letter was from a man with authority in a far-off place, a claim that Jonah had debts, to men he had wronged and to land he had left. The letter triggered the town's old fears. Soon, men who never wanted a fight were talking as if Jonah's past were a contagion. "I knew there was more to him than met the eye," Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice note dry as old bread. She wore a look of triumph that had the smell of victory in it. "You see, Lila? We told you." Lila felt a slow sinking the way a boat feels when the leak is small and constant. This time the shame wasn't for her but to the person she had grown to care for. She wanted to stand fierce for him, to take on the town, to point to every small mercy and demand reparation. But she remembered being small once, and how the world had a way of swallowing those who tried to roar. Jonah, for his part, met the news as a man who had measured wind. He did not deny the letters, but he did not let them become more than what they were, claims that could be met. He had a past, yes, and it had been brutal at times, but it had also made him who he was. He stood buttered by the world and offered himself to be judged. The climax arrived on a day when wind had thrown itself against the town and the sky pressed low. The man who had come with the letter, a creditor with a sour mouth and a horse that judged hard, came demanding more than papers. He wanted to take Jonah back for judgments and for blood owed. Men gathered. The town's small moralists peered and pointed. It took little to make trouble in a place like Marrow Bend, where a face could set off a row. Jonah said he would go with the man, that he would meet whatever was asked of him, but Lila could not watch him leave without doing something that felt like an answer both to the town and to the small, unresolved things she had carried. Standing on the porch that had seen winters and thaw, she crossed the board and placed her hand over his, the gesture smaller than a pledge and larger than a word. "You don't have to go," she said. "We can stand here and be steady together." He looked at her and the wind took the edge off one of his questions. He had never been one for promises that could not be held, but he was human and that human part felt what her touch suggested, belonging. "I might have to," he said, voice low, "but I'll be back. And if I don't, then know I tried to make good of the bad." He closed his hand over hers in a squeeze that sounded like a vow in the place where vows are currency. He left. The town watched him go, lips pursed in an expression of something between approval and relief. When the horizon swallowed him, there wasn't much anybody could say. Months rolled like thunderheads. The saloon closed earlier and later, and Lila kept the kettle warm and the door open. She made pies and sold them and left some for people who slipped through the cracks. Letters from Jonah came when they could, short lines full of a man tightened by work and the taste of pen and paper. He wrote of trials met and debts settled and of nights where he had been scared and his hand had found the cold metal of a gun. There was an honesty in those letters that read like a confession and a promise and the proof that a man was trying to untangle himself from the kinds of obligations that could sit heavy on a life. Then, as was the way of the world, trouble returned in a new shape. A gang of men who had once known Jonah as an associate came riding through with a brand of resentment in their stride. They wanted to pull him back into a life he had walked from. They had a way of making threats, and their way involved eyes that did not blink and a patience for cruelty. They found Marrow bend light with the day and tried to take Jonah by force. The townspeople gathered in a way that matched the old stories. Some to see violence made into theater, others to be sure it would not come to their own porch. Jonah returned to town not as a man broken, but as one who carried honesty in a heart that had been beaten but not killed. He rode in with a face like a man having gone through winter and come out leaner for it. He had new scars, yes, and old ones, but his voice had a steadiness that matched Lila's. He had returned to honor a reckoning rather than to run. The gang thought to throw the town into memory and claim Jonah by force. They did not account for the people who had found their backbone in watching someone else steady. When they moved to take Jonah, there was an unexpected thing. The town spoke up. People who had once withheld everything now found that Jonah had, in his return, made a place for them to step in and defend what had grown in their hearts. Men and women, who had been careful of making noise, marched into the way with grit and a kind of quiet fury. The fight that followed was not glamorous. It was the kind of messy thing that leaves bruises and splintered wood. Voices rose. The crack of a gun sounded like a bell tolling for some old falsehood. When it was over, the gang had left with fewer numbers and more contrition than they had worn. Jonah stood with Lila at his side as the dust settled around them like a benediction. He did not need to be big. He only needed to be there, and it counted for more than the town had learned to say. After the dust settled, the men who had been loud in their criticism found themselves looking at Lila with something like respect. She did not gloat. She let the quiet do its work. Jonah, for his part, did not declare himself a hero. He stayed and worked, and he treated people better than they had treated him because he had been shown what. He spoke to the town in a way that was neither preach nor boast. "We don't owe each other the weight of the past," he told them in the saloon when the storm had passed. "We owe each other the measure of who we are now. If we keep measure by what a man wore or what a woman's dress says, then we'll be small forever." The town listened, which was the sort of miracle that can be ordinary. People began, slowly, to change their manners. Mrs. Cartwright found smaller things to say in the mornings and more time to watch the color in the sky. Mayor Benning stopped making little pronouncements and instead chose to write a letter to the nearest newspaper about a town that had met a test and found itself the richer. Pastor Hale found a new note in his sermons, the note of mercy married to truth. Lila and Jonah made a home in a small way that seemed honest. It was a cabin of sun-warmed wood, with a porch that welcomed the wind. They filled it with small things: a chair made comfortable by constant sitting, a kettle that always had water ready to boil, a locket with a photograph from a long-ago life Jonah had once lived that he handed to Lila one evening like a token and the press of a hand that said, "I trust you." There were days when they fought about small things, the way he left boots in the kitchen or how she stored the sugar, and in those fights they practiced being gentle with each other's fault lines. In every reconciliation there was the convicting sweetness of being known. The months softened past. Annabelle grew less weary and more full of child talk and play. She found a room at the back of the saloon that had been turned into a place where chores were lighter and the world a little kinder. Jonah taught the child to ride carefully along the ridge where the prairie met the sky. Lila made pies besting what she had once dared and sold them, their recipe a secret kindness she kept because it tasted better when it was shared and not. Together, the trio, rough, tender, and hopeful, stitched the town's edges with a thread that was not loud but solid. There was, finally, the old storytelling question: would it be forever? The world has a habit of testing that which looks settled. But Lila and Jonah had discovered a rare thing: that steadiness is a matter of choice and that redemption is less about the reparations one makes to others and more about the promises one keeps to oneself. When the time came for Jonah to leave for a short trip to help settle accounts beyond the neighboring county, the town turned out to see him off with a curious tenderness. He had never asked them for anything, had never demanded that they change their manners, but they had, eventually, and that change looked like warmth. The sheriff shook his hand with the sort of sincerity that was hard to feign. Mrs. Cartwright, with a new softness to her features, offered him a pie as if to say she could finally face him. Jonah left on a morning when the sun had decided to be gentle. Lila stood at the door and did not cry. There was knowledge in her chest that things do not end because someone leaves. Sometimes leaving is a way of showing what is intended to stay. She pressed a coin into his hand. 2 ones wrapped in a cheery sort of courage, and watched him ride out, his hat shadowing his eyes, his horse clipping a steady way out of town. Months later, as the season turned and the prairie began to light up with the wild grass of new growth, Jonah returned. He was leaner, not harsh. There were letters folded in his jacket. He carried quieter burdens now, the kind that matched the density of someone who had put wrongs right and learned the measure of his own hands. Lila met him with a cup of coffee and a look that said all several kinds of yes and some new kinds of promise. They walked home together and took to the porch and sat, not in a hurry to paint vows but content to plant new things. The town had changed not because of one answer but because of many small ones. People had learned that the world can be shaped by steady hands, by those who insist on small acts of kindness. They found their manners improved by habit rather than by decree. The saloon's doors no longer swung with the same slack as they had before. Someone had been given a name and the town softened around it. There were quieter lessons yet. Lila's mark, the long map of pain on her arm, did not disappear. It remained, a reminder carved into her skin of a life that had been sharper once and now was being smoothed by the roles she'd chosen. Jonah did not fix it because scars make up the ledger of a soul. He learned to put his hand over it sometimes and let his thumb move like a stitch. One evening, long after they had stopped counting the days and instead counted the bread and the laughter, Lila stood with Jonah under the sky. Stars leaned like eyes watching over small miracles. They did not talk much. Words had been used up in other seasons. Instead, they let silence gather around them like a warm blanket. They were not perfect, each of them, and they had old things they could not fully erase. But there was an availability in their lives now, a willingness to be witnessed and a willingness to be called into account. It was enough. If you saw yourself in her, if memory of a woman quiet in a corner or a man worn and watchful stirs something inside you, remember one thing plain as a coin. Some roots grow in silence. They crack the soil out of sight. They find water under the stones where no one looks. They become trees that give shade without asking permission. They had been taught to be ashamed once. They left that teaching behind, replacing it with a new curriculum. Kindness is not widely taught, but it is learned by doing. A man who was called dangerous learned he could be a quiet altar of steadiness. A woman who had been called only the help learned to answer to her name without fear. The town, which had been small and sure of itself, learned mercy without giving away its backbone. There were no grand, final speeches. There were small things that accumulated to mean something larger. A repaired roof mended side by side, a pie baked with 2 hands instead of one, a child taught to ride straight. There was the day Jonah walked into the saloon and stopped the town from a slow slide into old cruelties, not with a shout but with a look and the steady press of presence. The lesson was not yelled into the wind but sewn into the fabric of the place. Steady people are worth finding, and when you do, you keep them. She gave everything without asking, and finally someone gave back. If her story hit you hard, don't forget the ones who stay quiet. See the backs bent to work and the eyes that look away in public but burn like a coal inside. They are keeping something alive. You might be the person to ask their name, to offer a cup of coffee, to steady them when the town does not. Often the brave things are small and quiet and cost less than we imagine. They cost dignity and sometimes time, but they pay back in a measure few things can. Belonging. They called her just the help, and for years that was all they saw. But he stood up and he said her name. In the end, it was neither thunder nor law that changed the town but a whisper that grew steady and an answering hand that would not let go. And that's how a whisper changed a town.